In this lesson, we'll be discussing feather effects. If you'd like to follow along, go under the File menu to Open, and in the Sample Files folder, scroll down to 1402, Working with Feather Effects, and just click Open. Before we get started, I'm going to go to my Zoom tool and just click and drag across my layout to move a lot closer in. And I'm also going to scroll over a bit. I'm going to go to my selection tool and just click on that top motorcycle image. To apply an effect, I have to open my effects panel. All of the effects are actually listed under the FX pop-up menu. I'm going to go all the way down to something called Basic Feather. The reason why it's called Basic Feather is feather existed before the two other feather effects were introduced in a more recent version of InDesign. So when directional feather and gradient feather were introduced, feather became basic feather. I'm going to select that. In the dialog box, let me just move it over so we can see what's happening. Why don't we go through some of the options? First, there's something called feather width. Width is a setting that you'll see in a lot of effects. And what it is the width of the transparent effect. In this case, feather width is the width of the feathering. On the outside of the object is totally transparent. And 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of the object in all directions, the object is totally opaque. So, if I click my up arrow, you can see that the transparency is moving further and further in. The next setting is called choke. Choke is actually a way of skewing the most transparent part of the effect further inward. In other effects, you're going to see a term called spread. It's exactly the same thing, only it's moving in an outward direction instead of inward. Let me click on the little scrubby slider arrow and just drag to choke the most transparent part of the effect further into the object. If I go all the way up to 100%, it's skewing the effect all the way in. So it's going instantly from totally transparent to totally opaque at exactly 0.375 inches in. Let me drag this further out and go all the way down to 0% choke. The next setting is called corners. By default, it's using something called diffused. Diffused is kind of a nondescript way that feather will handle the corners. You'll see what I mean when we go to rounded, and you can see that now it's rounding the effect in the corners. There's also sharp, which you can see the feathering is going sharply into the corners of the object. Let me go back to the default diffused. Noise is a way of adding texture to the transparent effect, another term that you will see in every one of the transparent effects. By adding a little bit of grain or texture, it's making the effect look less computer generated, more natural. So if I were to add 5% or so, it's just enough texture to make it look less computer generated. But watch what happens if I drag this all the way up to 100%. I get a feathering grunge effect, which is really kind of cool. Let me go back down to about 5% or so and click OK. Now, just to show you that this is not feathering from totally opaque to white, I'm going to drag the object over the top of the red background color. And you can see that it really is going out to transparent. I'm going to scroll down a bit and drag this second image of the motorcycle taking a curve over the top of the red rectangle. And I'm going to apply another feather effect. I'm going to click down on the FX pop-up and go to something called directional feather. It's very similar to basic feather, except I have control over the feather widths on the top, the bottom, and both the left and the right sides. I can add noise, just like in the basic feather effect, and I can choke the effect further in so it's transparent further into the shape, skewing the most transparent part of the effect further in. And I can also angle this effect if I wanted. I'm just going to click OK. I'm going to select the next graphic and drag that over so it snaps into position, and we're going to apply another kind of feather effect. I'm going to go under the FX pop-up to something called gradient feather. You can see what it's doing. It's actually using a gradient to feather the object. So it's going from totally opaque to totally transparent over the length of this gradient. So if I were to click on one of the gradient stops and move it further towards the right, you'll see that the width of the gradient becomes much less. I could also flip around that gradient so it is exactly the opposite of what it was originally. I could change the opacity of any stop. Maybe I'll add another stop. And you can see that its opacity is 58.57%. Well, I can change that to anything. So I have a lot of control over how transparent certain parts of this gradient are. I can also choose, instead of linear, radial. Let me flip this back around, and you can see that is very definitely a radial gradient feather effect. Now, there is another way to apply the gradient feather. I'm going to hit Cancel. And to get to a tool that applies a gradient feather, I want you to hit Shift-G. And if you look in your Tools panel, there's the Gradient Swatch tool, and immediately under that is the Gradient Feather tool that is now selected. Very easy tool to use. It works just like the Gradient tool. I'm going to click and drag straight down, following my margin, and watch what happens. It's applying the gradient feather in the same way that it would apply a gradient. Wherever I click first is where the gradient feather starts. Whatever angle I pull along as I'm dragging is the angle of the gradient feather. Wherever I let go of my mouse is where the gradient feather ends. Let me go into preview mode just so you can see what this looks like. I'm going to hit my W key and then go to my selection tool and deselect the image. This is the kind of thing that without this effect in InDesign, you would have to go into Photoshop to create something like this. So having these Photoshop-like effects in InDesign saves a lot of time. In upcoming lessons, we'll continue discussing effects and transparency.